My name is Audrey. I am 34 years old. 42 days after my grandfather died, my parents sat me down at their dining room table and casually explained that they were taking my $450,000 inheritance and giving it to my younger sister. They used words like fairness and family. They told me my sister's husband needed the money to bail out another failed startup, and since I had a stable salary as a supply chain analyst, I would survive just fine without the funds my grandfather had explicitly left to me in writing. I sat there, watching my 31-year-old sister scroll on her phone with a faint, satisfied smile. She was waiting for me to scream, to cry, to beg them to reconsider. Instead, I said almost nothing during that conversation, because they did not know I had already pulled the public probate records. They did not know I had already met with a ruthless estate litigator the previous week, and they did not know that by trying to take my share, they had just triggered a legal trap that would eventually strip them of their own inheritance and leave them with nothing. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled their lives using their own arrogance, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Maya Tells Stories. But only if this story hits close to home. Drop a comment and tell me your age, where you are watching from right now, and what time it is there. I read every single comment. Now, let me take you back to that Sunday afternoon at 2:15. The drive from my apartment in White Plains down to my parents' house in Syosset usually gave me enough time to prepare for the usual family dynamics. I knew something was wrong the moment I walked through the front door. The house smelled of lemon polish and stale coffee. My mother, Susan, directed me straight to the formal dining room. We never sat in the formal dining room unless someone was in trouble. I took a seat at the heavy mahogany table. My sister Chloe sat directly across from me. She did not look up, just kept tapping her manicured nails against the back of her phone. My father, Richard, stood near the window, staring out at the driveway, deliberately avoiding my eyes. My mother folded her hands on the polished wood. She wore a practiced look of maternal sacrifice, a specific expression she reserved for moments when she was about to ask someone else to foot a bill. "Audrey," she began, her tone measured and soft, "your father and I have been reviewing Grandpa Thomas and his estate distribution. We have decided to reallocate your portion to Chloe. My grandfather was a retired actuary. He lived his life by spreadsheets and risk assessments. His estate was valued at $1.4 million. The will he left behind was unambiguous. My designated share was clearly spelled out." I shifted my gaze from my mother to my father. He kept his focus on the window. "Brandon's logistics business is struggling again," my mother continued, mentioning Chloe's husband as if he were a charity case rather than a serial bad investment. "They are facing a very tough quarter. You have a stable career. You will be fine. We just want to ensure things are equitable for everyone." Fairness. That was the word she used to justify taking what belonged to me. I watched Chloe set her phone face down on the table. A faint smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. They assumed they held all the leverage. They believed their authority as my parents overrode New York State probate law. They expected a reaction. They expected me to negotiate. But to understand why I simply nodded and asked for a glass of water, you have to understand the math of my 20s. You have to understand the decade I spent acting as the designated shock absorber for a family that viewed my stability as an endless checking account. To understand why I did not scream or throw my water glass across the mahogany table that afternoon, you have to understand the math of my 20s. I was the designated shock absorber for my family. My entire adult life had been conditioned around the expectation that my stability existed to subsidize my sister's chaos. By the time I turned 30 years old, I had paid Chloe's rent 14 separate times. I did not keep a vague mental tally. I kept a spreadsheet. The first time happened when I was 24. Chloe texted me a long, tearful paragraph about her roommate moving out unannounced. I wired her $800. The fifth time, my mother called me, her voice hushed, saying Chloe was between jobs and the landlord was threatening eviction. I logged into Chloe's resident portal and paid the balance directly. By the 14th time, the excuses had vanished entirely. The text from my mother simply read, "Your sister needs rent this month. Please handle it by Friday." The transaction became an expectation. My paycheck was treated as a secondary household account. The financial drain escalated rapidly. When Chloe decided the energy in her Brooklyn apartment was toxic, she packed her bags and moved out, with 8 months left on her lease. The management company hit her with a $6,200 penalty. They threatened to send the balance to a collection agency, which would have ruined her credit. My father called me on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing supply chain metrics at my desk. He did not ask if I had the funds. He told me the family needed to protect Chloe's future and instructed me to clear the debt. I paid the $6,200. I saved the receipt in a digital folder labeled Family Expenses. I was building a record long before I knew I would ever need one. Then came Brandon. Chloe married him when she was 28. He possessed a lot of confidence and zero business acumen. In the fall of 2021, he bankrupted his second startup. It was some sort of boutique logistics application that burned through capital and produced nothing. His creditors were circling. My parents invited me to a quiet dinner at a restaurant in Midtown. They ordered wine, made small talk about my job, and then my mother reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. She told me Brandon was facing a severe cash shortage. She said it would reflect poorly on the entire family if he was forced into personal bankruptcy. Then, looking me dead in the eye, she suggested I tap into my 401k to cover his shortfalls. I stared at her. I calculated the early withdrawal penalties, the income tax hit, and the lost compound interest over the next 30 years. She was asking me to compromise my own retirement, to willingly incur massive financial penalties, just to buy her son-in-law another few months of pretending to be a successful entrepreneur. She called it saving the family from embarrassment. I pulled my hand out from under hers. I looked at my father, who was staring intently at his water glass, letting his wife do the heavy lifting. I looked back at my mother and said a single word: no. She blinked. She asked me to repeat myself. I told her my retirement accounts were not a slush fund for Brandon's bad business decisions. I paid for my own dinner, stood up, and walked out of the restaurant. That was my first real boundary. The response was immediate and calculated. My mother did not speak to me for 68 days. She did not call on Thanksgiving. She did not text. She utilized silence as a punishment, expecting the isolation to break me down until I offered the money along with an apology. I tracked the days on my calendar. Day 12, day 34, day 50. I did not reach out. On day 69, she sent a text about a random television show, as if nothing had ever happened. The subject of the 401k was never brought up again, but the underlying resentment became a permanent fixture in our relationship. Grandpa Thomas saw all of it. He lived in a quiet ranch house in Syosset, just a few miles from my parents. He was a retired actuary. His entire career had been built on evaluating risk, analyzing probabilities, and understanding the long-term consequences of bad variables. He did not believe in excuses. He believed in ledgers. During those 68 days of silence from my mother, I drove out to visit him on Sunday mornings. We would sit on his back porch drinking bitter black coffee while the neighborhood slowly woke up. He rarely offered unsolicited advice, but he observed everything. One morning, he set his mug down on the wooden railing, looked at me and said, "Audrey, numbers do not lie, but your mother sure does." He knew exactly what was happening. He recognized that Chloe was a financial black hole. He saw how my parents enabled her behavior, shielding her from the consequences of her actions by transferring the burden onto my shoulders. He viewed my parents as negligent managers of their own household. He viewed me as the only performing asset in the family. When his health began to decline, he approached his estate planning with the same clinical precision he used in his actuarial work. He knew that if he left his wealth unprotected, my parents would inevitably funnel every single dollar toward Chloe and Brandon. He structured his will meticulously to prevent that exact scenario. He divided the liquid assets clearly. He designated specific accounts. He protected my share with layers of rigid legal terminology. However, he made one decision that provided the catalyst for everything that followed. He named my parents as the co-executors of the estate. He likely did this simply because they lived nearby and could handle the physical sale of his house and the clearing of his belongings. He gave them an administrative job. My parents misunderstood the assignment. They confused the role of a legal fiduciary with the role of a sovereign ruler. They believed that being named executors granted them the authority to rewrite the document according to their own preferences. They spent their entire lives operating under the assumption that their parental authority superseded any other rule. They genuinely thought their status as my mother and father was a higher power than New York State estate law. They thought they could sit me down in a dining room, use a soft voice, and inform me that my inheritance was being reallocated to my sister because she needed it more. They assumed I would absorb this loss just as I had absorbed the rent payments, the broken lease, and the emotional manipulation of my 20s. But I was no longer the girl who paid the $6,200 penalty just to keep the peace. I was a professional analyst who tracked data for a living. I had spent years watching them twist the truth, and I knew that if they were arrogant enough to announce this theft to my face, they were arrogant enough to leave a paper trail. The escalation did not start at that dining room table. It started exactly 14 days prior, when a standard white envelope arrived in my mailbox. Inside that envelope was a document that my parents thought would secure their plan. Instead, it was the exact piece of evidence I needed to begin dismantling their entire reality. Exactly 14 days before that Sunday dining room meeting, I walked down to the lobby of my apartment building in White Plains to check my mail. Tucked between a utility bill and a grocery circular was a standard, legal-sized envelope. The return address belonged to my parents. I opened it while standing by the elevator. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The header read, "Summary of Estate Distribution." In my profession, you are trained to look for anomalies. A single fabricated data point can collapse a global distribution network. You learn to trust your eyes over your expectations. The document, trembling slightly in my hand, was a glaring anomaly. It was typed in a standard, unremarkable font. It lacked a notary stamp. It carried no law firm letterhead. It was just a generic word processor document printed on cheap home office paper. The second paragraph contained a very specific, carefully constructed sentence. It stated that as executors of the estate, Richard and Susan Hayes retained the discretionary power to adjust disbursements based on beneficiary need. My father spent 30 years working as a regional manager for a mid-tier paper supply company. He was accustomed to sending memos and watching subordinates comply without asking questions. My mother chaired the local zoning board, a role she treated like a Supreme Court seat. They were used to operating in environments where their confidence masqueraded as actual authority. They assumed this piece of paper would intimidate me into quiet compliance. They assumed I would read the word discretionary and simply fold. Most people in my position would have dialed their parents immediately. They would have demanded an explanation. They would have initiated a screaming match over the phone. I did not unlock my screen. Arguing gives your opposition a chance to refine their strategy. Arguing tells them what you know. I required raw data. I needed the source material before I could calculate my next move. The following morning, I requested a half-day of personal time from my logistics director. I walked to the local station and boarded the 10:15 train to Grand Central. I sat by the window watching the autumn trees blur past the glass, running the variables in my head. A legal will becomes a public record the moment it enters probate. My parents were relying on the assumption that I would be too intimidated, or perhaps too lazy, to verify their claims. They placed a bet on my passivity. I navigated the subway down to the financial district. The New York County Surrogate Court sits inside an imposing granite building. You walk through metal detectors, move past armed guards, and step into a space that smells of floor wax and centuries of documented family disputes. It is a structure built entirely on rigid rules and procedural law, a stark contrast to my family and their reliance on emotional manipulation. I approached the records clerk, a tired-looking woman who processed generational greed for a living. I handed her my grandfather's case number. 10 minutes later, she slid a thick manila folder across the counter. I carried it to a scarred wooden viewing table in the corner of the room, sat down, and opened the file. Grandpa Thomas did not write a generic summary. His actual last will and testament was 44 pages long. It was drafted by a Manhattan estate firm that specialized in high net worth individuals. The pages felt heavy, printed on high-quality bond paper. The legal language was dense, precise, and devoid of any sentimental warmth. I turned the pages slowly, scanning the clauses, the subclauses, and the specific directives. Then I found it. Section 4, paragraph B. I read the text once. I stopped breathing for a few seconds. I read it a second time. Then I read it a third time, letting the sheer magnitude of my grandfather's foresight wash over me. It was a masterpiece of legal paranoia. Grandpa knew his son. He knew his daughter-in-law. He knew exactly what they would attempt to do the moment he was no longer sitting on his porch to stop them. He knew they would try to divert his wealth to subsidize Chloe and Brandon. So he built a fail-safe mechanism directly into the architecture of the estate. The clause explicitly established a strict fiduciary duty. It stated in unambiguous terms that the executors possessed zero discretionary power to alter the established disbursement percentages. My parents were designated as administrators, nothing more. They had no legal right to decide who needed the money more. But the paragraph did not stop there. Grandpa included a specific forfeiture penalty. The text dictated that if the executors attempted to misappropriate funds, alter the designated shares, or intentionally defraud any named beneficiary, they would not simply be removed from their roles. They would trigger an automatic default. They would legally forfeit their own inheritance. I pulled out a notepad and wrote down the math. My parents were slated to receive $500,000 from the estate. I was slated to receive $450,000. The document resting on the wooden table dictated that if they tried to steal my share, their $500,000 would immediately default to the remaining compliant beneficiary. That meant me. I sat at that table for a long time. The ambient noise of the records room faded into the background. The clerks sorting files, the lawyers whispering to clients, the hum of the ancient ventilation system. It all fell away. I was holding a loaded weapon that my grandfather had reached forward through time to hand to me. My parents had mailed me that fake summary, thinking they held the high ground. They thought they were issuing an executive order. In reality, they were walking blindfolded into a trap. They had just provided me with documented proof of their intent to violate the fiduciary clause. A profound shift happened in my mind right then. If I called them and warned them about Section 4, they would retreat. They would play the victim. They would claim the summary document was just a misunderstanding, a simple administrative error. They would process the will normally, I would receive my designated share, and they would receive theirs. But they would spend the rest of my life punishing me for securing what was mine. They would resume the passive-aggressive comments. They would resume the requests for Chloe's rent. They would resume the demands to bail out Brandon. The cycle of extraction would never end. I realized, staring at my grandfather's signature, that I did not want to merely survive this transaction. I wanted to terminate the cycle permanently. I did not need to fight them. I did not need to argue about fairness or morality. I just needed them to proceed with their plan. I needed them to put their theft in writing, signed and dated, moving past a vague statement of intent and into an actionable, verifiable crime. I closed the thick manila folder. I returned it to the clerk, walked out of the granite building, and stepped into the cold afternoon sunlight of Lower Manhattan. I pulled out my phone and began searching for the most ruthless estate litigator in the city. The dynamic had changed. My parents thought they were managing a compliant daughter. They were about to face a highly motivated analyst, armed with a forfeiture clause. I located Ms. Gable through a quiet referral from a corporate compliance officer I worked with. She was a senior partner at a boutique firm in Midtown Manhattan, specializing in high net worth estate litigation. Her office was a reflection of her methodology. It contained no family photographs, no warm lighting, and no comfortable couches. It featured glass walls, a stainless steel desk, and a panoramic view of the city skyline. She wore sharp, tailored blazers and operated with the warmth of a surgical scalpel. She did not offer me platitudes about grief or family strife. She offered me a seat and asked for the documents. I placed 2 items on her desk. First, the unnotarized summary of estate distribution my parents had mailed me. Second, a certified copy of my grandfather's actual 44-page will, with Section 4, Paragraph B, highlighted in yellow. Ms. Gable picked up the fake summary. She read it once, her expression unchanging. Then she picked up the certified will. She spent 4 minutes reading the fiduciary clauses in silence. She set the papers down, took a sip of black coffee, and looked at me over the rim of her glasses. She told me my parents were attempting blatant fiduciary fraud. She explained that their generic document was an amateurish attempt to bypass ironclad legal directives. However, she also issued a critical warning. Right now, that piece of paper was merely a statement of desire. It was not a finalized financial transaction. In the eyes of the court, contemplating a crime is different from executing one. If we filed a lawsuit based solely on that mailed summary, my parents could easily backtrack. They could hire a defense attorney who would claim the document was just a preliminary draft, a misunderstanding of their duties, or a simple clerical error. The judge might reprimand them, but they would likely retain their status as executors. We needed them to cross the line from intention to action. Ms. Gable outlined the strategy. We needed my parents to officially initiate the transfer of funds to my sister, or we needed them to explicitly state their intent to defraud me on the record. We needed undeniable, admissible evidence that they knew what they were doing and were doing it anyway. That requirement launched a 45-day period of calculated silence. I had to play the role of the defeated, compliant daughter. I had to let them believe their intimidation tactics had worked. It was an exercise in extreme psychological discipline. The hardest part was watching my sister spend my money in her head. Chloe had never understood the concept of earned capital. She viewed wealth as a natural right, something that should simply flow toward her whenever she desired a lifestyle upgrade. 10 days into our waiting period, she began posting on her social media accounts. I did not follow her, but I monitored a public viewing page to gather intelligence. She uploaded a sequence of photos from a luxury car dealership in Greenwich. She was posing next to an imported SUV with a sticker price hovering around $80,000. The leather seats were pristine white. The caption read, "Big upgrades coming soon, manifesting my best life." She was tagging her husband, Brandon, adding champagne glass emojis. I sat at my desk at the logistics firm, running supply chain algorithms on my dual monitors while observing my sister plan a luxury vehicle purchase using the exact dollar amount my grandfather had designated for my future. The audacity was staggering. She knew the source of those funds. She knew my parents were stripping my inheritance to bail out her husband's failed business, and her immediate response was to go shopping for a high-end status symbol. I did not comment on the photos. I took screenshots, cataloged them with dates and timestamps, and saved them to a secure encrypted folder. Every post was another data point demonstrating their profound lack of financial responsibility, proving exactly why my grandfather had instituted the forfeiture clause in the first place. Meanwhile, my mother initiated a campaign of passive-aggressive text messages. She was probing my defenses, trying to verify that I had accepted the new arrangement. Her messages were masterpieces of manipulation, designed to make me feel guilty for a conflict she had manufactured. On day 18, she sent a text stating that family requires sacrifice, and she hoped I was finding peace with the estate decisions. On day 27, she forwarded a quote about how forgiveness is a choice that frees the soul. She was trying to secure the moral high ground while actively orchestrating a theft. My responses were brief, neutral, and carefully drafted. I replied with phrases like, "I am processing everything," or "I understand your perspective." I never agreed to the reallocation. I never gave them permission. I simply mirrored their language just enough to keep them comfortable. I let them believe they had won the psychological war. Arrogant people become sloppy when they believe they are untouchable. My parents had spent their entire lives treating me as an extension of their own will. Because I had capitulated in my early 20s, paying Chloe's rent and covering her penalties, they assumed my refusal to drain my 401k for Brandon was just a temporary rebellion. They assumed their fake summary document had effectively put me back in my place. They grew so comfortable in their assumed victory that they decided a final, formal conversation was necessary. They wanted to look me in the eye and deliver the final blow. They wanted the satisfaction of my verbal surrender. On day 41, my father called me. He asked me to come down to Syosset that Sunday afternoon for a brief family meeting to finalize the estate paperwork. His tone was casual, mimicking a manager scheduling a routine performance review. I told him I would be there at 2:15. I called Ms. Gable immediately after hanging up. I relayed the details of the upcoming meeting. She reminded me of New York state law regarding recorded conversations. New York operates under a one-party consent statute. This means that as long as one person involved in a conversation consents to the recording, the audio is legally obtained and fully admissible in a court of law. Since I was a participant, my consent was the only consent required. Ms. Gable gave me specific instructions. Do not provoke them. Do not threaten legal action. Ask clarifying questions. Make them repeat their intentions. Force them to articulate that they are taking specific funds designated for me and giving those funds to my sister. Above all, she told me to secure a physical signature if possible. I spent Saturday evening preparing. I did not rehearse arguments. I rehearsed emotional detachment. I practiced keeping my facial expressions neutral, slowing my heart rate, and maintaining a flat, steady vocal register. I treated the upcoming Sunday meeting exactly like a hostile corporate audit. When Sunday afternoon arrived, I parked my car in my parents' driveway. I walked up the brick pathway to the front door. The air was crisp, the neighborhood quiet. Before I reached out to turn the brass handle, I reached into the pocket of my wool coat. I unlocked my smartphone. I opened the voice memo application. I pressed the red circular button in the center of the screen. The digital timer began counting the seconds. 1, 2, 3. I locked the screen, leaving the application running silently in the dark fabric of my pocket. I took one final, slow breath, letting the cold autumn air fill my lungs, and then I opened the door to face the family that was about to confess to a felony. The digital timer on my phone was counting the seconds, silently, in the dark fabric of my wool coat. I stepped into the dining room and took my seat at the mahogany table. The environment was exactly as I had left it in my memory, a staged theater for family compliance. My mother, Susan, sat at the head of the table. My father, Richard, stood near the window. My sister, Chloe, sat across from me, her manicured fingers resting lightly on the polished wood. New York operates under a strict one-party consent statute for audio recordings. The microphone in my pocket was sensitive enough to capture every breath, every shifting chair, and every spoken syllable in that room. "Audrey," my mother began, picking up the thread of the conversation. Her voice dripped with an artificial, honeyed sympathy that she typically reserved for public charity events. "Your father and I have finalized the estate distribution. We are redistributing your $450,000 to Chloe. It is already in motion." She stated the dollar amount clearly. That was the first verifiable data point captured on the audio file. She did not say a portion. She did not say a fraction. She stated the exact numeric value designated to me by my grandfather, confirming she knew precisely what she was taking. I looked across the table at Chloe. My sister offered a soft, practiced sigh, playing the role of the reluctant beneficiary. Chloe had spent her entire adult life avoiding the friction of consequence. When she crashed her first car at 19, my parents bought her a newer model because they deemed the older one unsafe. When she failed out of her graduate program at 25, they framed it as a brave pivot toward her true passions. She had never been required to perform a basic cost-benefit analysis. Now, sitting across from me, she genuinely believed she was entitled to a nearly $500,000 bailout simply because her husband could not balance a business ledger. I shifted my gaze to my father. He was staring at the driveway outside, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Dad," I said, keeping my vocal register perfectly even, "do you agree with breaching Grandpa's will?" My father possessed a lifelong habit of deferring difficult decisions to my mother. During his 30 years as a regional manager, he delegated every termination and every disciplinary action to his subordinates. He despised friction. He preferred the illusion of peace over the discomfort of accountability. He finally turned away from the window, though he still refused to meet my eyes directly. He looked somewhere near my left shoulder. "It is for the best, Audrey," he muttered. His voice was recorded crisp and clear. "Chloe is drowning. We have to throw her a life preserver. You know how to swim." That was the second verifiable data point: acknowledgement of the action, justification for the theft, and an explicit admission that they were bypassing the legal parameters of the will to execute their own moral judgment. They waited for the explosion. My mother leaned forward slightly, bracing for the argument she was prepared to win. She had likely rehearsed her talking points in the mirror, ready to deploy phrases about selfishness, familial duty, and sacrifice. I gave her nothing to push against. I channeled the tone of a meteorologist delivering a Midwestern weather report, cold, factual, and entirely detached from the outcome. "I see," I said, folding my hands on the table. The shift in my demeanor caught them off guard. Chloe blinked, her manufactured sadness faltering. "Since this alters my expected tax liabilities for the upcoming fiscal year," I continued, speaking slowly to ensure the microphone captured every word, "I am going to need a formal acknowledgement." My mother furrowed her brow, suspicious but intrigued. "What kind of acknowledgement?" "I am a supply chain analyst," I explained, leaning into my professional identity to sell the deception. "My accountant requires a clear paper trail for any variance in expected asset distribution. A verbal conversation will not satisfy an IRS audit. I just need something in writing stating that you, acting in your capacity as executors, are choosing to reallocate my specific inheritance to Chloe due to her financial hardship. It protects me from being taxed on funds I never received." The tension in the dining room evaporated instantly. My mother practically beamed. Her posture relaxed, and a genuine smile replaced the artificial sympathy. In her mind, the war was over. I had bypassed the emotional betrayal and gone straight to the administrative logistics. She interpreted my request for tax documentation as a total, unconditional surrender. "Of course, sweetheart," she said, her voice lifting with the triumphant relief of a conqueror. "Whatever you need for your accountant, we want to make this transition as smooth as possible for you." Susan loved paperwork. She loved bureaucratic processes that validated her authority. As the chair of the local zoning board, she thrived on issuing permits and drafting official notices. I was handing her an opportunity to formalize her victory. She stood up, walked to the antique credenza against the wall, and retrieved a piece of heavy, stock ivory stationery and a gold-plated fountain pen. She sat back down at the head of the table and began to write. The scratching of the metal nib against the thick paper echoed in the quiet room. My phone recorded the sound of her drafting her own legal execution. I watched her form the letters. I watched my sister sip her water, looking entirely relaxed, already planning the interior upgrades for her new vehicle. I watched my father finally sit down at the table, relieved that the anticipated screaming match had never materialized. My mother finished the first paragraph and read it aloud, seeking my approval. "Let us see," she murmured. We, Richard and Susan Hayes, acting as executors for the estate of Thomas Hayes, formally acknowledge the reallocation of the $450,000 inheritance originally designated to Audrey Hayes. These funds are being redirected to Chloe and Brandon due to immediate financial hardship, effectively overriding the standard disbursement schedule. She looked up at me, the gold pen hovering over the paper. Does that cover the tax requirements? It is very thorough, I replied. Just ensure you sign and date it at the bottom. She signed her name with a dramatic, sweeping flourish. She then slid the ivory paper and the gold pen across the mahogany wood toward my father. Richard, your signature goes right here next to mine, she instructed. My father did not read the document. He did not evaluate the legal terminology his wife had just employed. He simply picked up the pen and signed his name, confirming his complicity. He dated it in the bottom right corner. My mother picked up the paper, blew on the ink for a brief second, and handed it across the table to me. I took the document. I held it in both hands, reviewing the text. It was perfect. It contained names, dates, explicit dollar amounts, and an unambiguous admission of intent to bypass the legally binding directives of my grandfather's will. They had bypassed the unnotarized, vague summary they mailed me weeks ago. They had upgraded their offense to a documented, signed confession of fiduciary breach and federal wire fraud. They had handed me the exact mechanism required to activate the forfeiture clause. I folded the heavy ivory paper precisely in half. I opened my leather purse and tucked the document into a zippered interior pocket. The snap of the metal zipper shutting was loud in the quiet room. "Thank you," I said. I stood up from the table. "You are being very mature about this, Audrey," my father offered, attempting to end the interaction on a note of paternal pride. "We appreciate your understanding." I smoothed the front of my coat. I looked at my father, then at my sister, and finally at my mother. They were a tableau of arrogant complacency. "I will let you know when I have clarity," I said. I turned and walked out of the dining room. I walked down the hallway, opened the front door, and stepped out into the crisp autumn afternoon. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind me. I walked down the brick pathway to my car, got inside, and locked the doors. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone. The voice memo application was still running. The timer read 12 minutes and 47 seconds. I pressed the red square to stop the recording. I saved the audio file, titled it Estate Confession, and immediately uploaded a copy to a secure cloud server. Then I forwarded the audio file and a scanned photograph of the handwritten letter directly to Ms. Gable's encrypted email address. The disbursement transfer to my sister was scheduled to execute on Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock. My parents thought they had 48 hours to celebrate their financial maneuvering. They had no idea that the machinery of their destruction was already in motion, and that Tuesday morning would bring a level of devastation they lacked the capacity to comprehend. The disbursement transfer was scheduled to execute on Tuesday morning at exactly 9 o'clock. For my parents, that specific hour represented the finish line. It was the moment their creative accounting would transform into a permanent reality. For me, that hour was merely a deadline for an entirely different operation. I woke up at 5:30 that morning. I brewed a pot of dark roast coffee, dressed in a tailored navy suit, and boarded the Metro North train down to my office in Manhattan. I watched the sunrise reflect off the Hudson River. My pulse rested at a steady 60 beats per minute. I felt no anxiety. I only felt the quiet anticipation of a well-engineered system functioning exactly as designed. Miles away in her high-rise office, Ms. Gable was already working. At 8:30 in the morning, 30 minutes before the bank opened its wire transfer window, she submitted an emergency ex parte injunction to the New York State Surrogate Court. An ex parte filing means the opposing party receives no prior warning. It is a legal strike designed to prevent the destruction or theft of contested assets. She did not submit a vague complaint. She filed a watertight dossier. It contained the certified will, highlighting the fiduciary directives. It included high-resolution scans of the handwritten ivory stationery my mother and father had signed on Sunday, demonstrating their explicit intent to bypass those directives. Finally, she attached a certified transcript and the raw digital audio file of my mother, stating the exact dollar amount she planned to redistribute. Judges overseeing estate law do not possess a sense of humor regarding fiduciary breach. They view the misappropriation of a deceased individual's assets as a direct insult to the court itself. The presiding judge reviewed the evidence, recognized the imminent threat of wire fraud, and immediately issued a restraining order on the entire Thomas Hayes estate. Electronic notices were instantly transmitted to the holding institutions. By 8:45, heavy digital padlocks clamped down on every single checking, savings, and brokerage account tied to my grandfather's name. No funds could enter, no funds could exit. The capital was frozen in place. At 9 o'clock, Chloe and Brandon were likely sitting in their overpriced Brooklyn apartment, staring at their online banking portal, waiting for a $450,000 lifeline to appear on their screen. Brandon needed that money desperately. His latest venture was a boutique shipping logistics application. He spent capital on sleek office space, custom-branded merchandise, and networking dinners, rather than developing a functional software product. He treated entrepreneurship as a lifestyle aesthetic rather than a financial discipline. His bridge loan was reportedly due by the end of the week. He required my grandfather's money to satisfy his creditors and avoid personal ruin. When the screen failed to refresh with the new balance at 9:15, they likely assumed it was a simple banking delay, a minor routing error. At 10:15, my smartphone began to vibrate on my desk. I was currently reviewing a global freight spreadsheet, tracking cargo containers moving across the Pacific Ocean. I glanced down at the glowing screen. The caller identification displayed my sister's name. I let it ring. The vibration stopped, then immediately started again. Chloe was trying a second time. I watched her name flash, allowing the call to route to voicemail. 2 minutes later, the screen displayed my mother's name. Susan Hayes rarely called me during business hours unless she required a favor. The device buzzed steadily against the wood of my desk. I took a sip of my coffee, keeping my eyes on my cargo routing data. I let the call end. Then came my father. Richard Hayes, calling in the middle of a Tuesday morning, signaled a severe escalation. He abhorred daytime interruptions. The notifications began stacking up in rapid succession. Chloe, Susan, Susan again, Richard, Chloe. Between 10:15 and 10:35, they accumulated 14 missed calls. I sat in my ergonomic chair, letting the silence perform the heavy lifting. Silence is a mirror. When you refuse to respond, panicked individuals are forced to look at their own actions. They were currently realizing that their sovereign authority had evaporated. At 10:45, the phone lit up with my mother's name for the 7th time. I reached out, picked up the device, and accepted the call. I did not say hello. I just brought the receiver to my ear. "Audrey!" my mother shrieked. Her voice was unrecognizable. The polished, honeyed tone she utilized at the dining room table was gone. The dignified posture of the local zoning board chairwoman had dissolved. She sounded like a cornered pedestrian. The audio quality was sharp, picking up ragged breathing and the sound of pacing footsteps in the background. "The bank is saying the accounts are locked pending litigation," she yelled, her pitch breaking on the final word. "The branch manager told your father a judge issued an emergency freeze. What did you do?" I kept my eyes on my spreadsheet, noting a minor delay in a shipping lane near Seattle. I maintained my professional, detached vocal register. "I did not do anything, Mom," I said smoothly. "My attorney filed your signed confession with the surrogate court." "What confession?" she stammered, the panic causing her to lose her grip on reality. "We signed a tax document. You asked for a tax document." "I asked for a formal acknowledgement of your actions," I corrected her. "You provided a handwritten, signed, and dated admission that you were willfully bypassing the legal parameters of the will to funnel my inheritance to Chloe. You attempted to steal $450,000. That is a felony." The line went dead silent. The realization hit her with the force of a freight train. She suddenly understood the trap I had laid in her dining room. She remembered the gold pen, the ivory paper, and her own triumphant smile. She realized I had bypassed the emotional argument and utilized her own arrogance to secure undeniable evidence. In the background of the call, I heard a new noise. It was Brandon. His voice echoed through the room, frantic and high-pitched. He was shouting about a vendor deadline, hyperventilating over the reality that his bailout had vanished. He demanded to know why the wire had failed. Chloe was crying loudly, a sustained wail of unfiltered entitlement facing its first real boundary. "You tricked us," my mother whispered, her tone shifting from panic to venom. "You set us up." "You set yourselves up," I replied. "I simply documented your behavior. You mailed me an unnotarized threat. I verified the actual law. You chose to ignore your fiduciary duty because you believed your status as my parents made you immune to consequences. You are tearing this family apart," she screamed, the volume spiking so high I had to pull the phone an inch away from my ear. "You are destroying your sister over a piece of paper. We are going to lose everything." I sat back in my chair looking out the window at the Manhattan skyline. The sky was a clear, brilliant blue. I felt no guilt. I felt no obligation to manage her emotional collapse. For a decade, I had absorbed their crises. I had paid the penalties for their poor decisions. I had played the reliable daughter while they treated me as an expendable resource. That era was permanently over. "No," I replied, my pulse entirely steady. "I am just enforcing the rules you thought did not apply to you. You wanted to redistribute assets based on who deserved them. The judge will now make that exact determination." She started to yell another accusation, preparing to deploy a lifetime of guilt trips and maternal manipulation. I did not allow her to finish the sentence. "All future communication goes through Ms. Gable," I said. I ended the call. I placed the phone face down on my desk. I took another sip of my coffee, returned my hands to my keyboard, and resumed routing cargo across the Pacific Ocean. The initial strike was complete. The assets were secured. The fraud was on the public record. But freezing the accounts was merely a preventative measure. The actual dismantling of their power required a formal legal proceeding. They would try to fight back. They would hire representation. They would attempt to twist the narrative and portray me as a greedy, ungrateful child trying to ruin her grieving parents. They were preparing for an emotional battlefield. They did not comprehend that we were heading into a deposition, a clinical environment where their tears held zero currency, and where a single highlighted paragraph would cost them $500,000. 3 weeks passed. During those 21 days, the silence from my end remained unbroken. I went to my office, analyzed my supply chain metrics, and drank my morning coffee. I did not monitor my family. I did not need to. The legal hold on the estate accounts was performing all the necessary communication. The funds were locked in a digital vault, inaccessible to anyone. Chloe and Brandon were likely experiencing the harsh friction of unpaid vendors and expiring bridge loans. My parents were likely mortgaging their pride, trying to understand how their sovereign authority had evaporated overnight. We convened on a Tuesday morning for the formal deposition. The location was a glass-walled conference room on the 42nd floor of Ms. Gable's firm in Midtown Manhattan. The space was designed to intimidate. The table was a massive slab of polished marble. The chairs were rigid, high-backed leather. The room offered a sweeping, unobstructed view of the city skyline, a visual reminder of the scale at which this particular law firm operated. My parents walked through the double doors looking 10 years older than they had in their dining room. Susan wore a muted gray suit, her usual zoning board confidence replaced by a hollow, defensive posture. Richard looked pale, dark circles bruising the skin under his eyes. He walked with a slight stoop, carrying the physical weight of his own miscalculations. Chloe followed closely behind them, radiating a defensive fury. She wore a designer trench coat that she kept adjusting, treating the deposition like a customer service complaint rather than a legal reckoning. She carried a premium iced coffee, sipping it loudly, entirely unaware of the gravity of the room. They had retained counsel. His name was Martin Caldwell. He was a general practice attorney operating out of a strip mall office in Nassau County. He handled local real estate closings, minor traffic violations, and simple wills. My parents hired him because he charged a fraction of a Manhattan litigator's hourly rate, and because he likely nodded along to their emotional narrative without demanding to review the raw data. Arrogant people seek out advisors who validate their worldview, avoiding specialists who challenge their assumptions. Ms. Gable sat across from him. She did not bring a legal pad. She brought 3 pristine manila folders. A certified court reporter sat at the head of the marble table, fingers hovering silently over the steno machine. The deposition began with standard procedural questions: names, addresses, confirmations of identity. Ms. Gable kept her voice level. She built a rhythmic, mundane cadence, lulling Caldwell into a false sense of security. He leaned back in his leather chair, hooking a thumb into his belt, attempting to project a casual dominance. Ms. Gable opened her first folder. She withdrew a single sheet of paper and slid it across the cool marble. The ivory stationery my mother had so proudly signed weeks earlier now carried a yellow exhibit sticker in the bottom right corner. "Mr. and Mrs. Hayes?" Ms. Gable asked, her tone conversational but surgically precise. "I am presenting Exhibit A. Can you verify the signatures at the bottom of this page?" My mother stared at her own looping handwriting. She swallowed hard, her throat clicking audibly in the quiet room. "That is my signature," she whispered, "and my husband's. Did you draft and sign this document indicating your explicit intent to illegally divert funds from the designated beneficiary, Audrey Hayes, to an alternate party?" Ms. Gable asked. Martin Caldwell raised a hand. He leaned forward, dropping his casual posture, attempting to protect his clients from the trap. "Objection," Caldwell stated, his voice carrying a slight tremor. "My clients were operating under the assumption of a private family arrangement. They were mediating a domestic dispute, not executing a formal banking maneuver. The text on that paper is conversational. It reflects a desire to keep the peace, not a binding legal contract. They did not understand it as a diversion of funds." Ms. Gable did not argue with him. She did not raise her voice. She merely offered a tight, chilling smile. It was the expression of an architect watching a demolition proceed exactly according to the blueprints. She opened her second manila folder. She withdrew a certified, court-stamped copy of Grandpa Thomas and his 44-page last will and testament. She slid it across the marble surface until it bumped gently against the ivory letter. "Mr. Caldwell," Ms. Gable said, addressing the opposing lawyer directly for the first time, "I direct your attention to Section 4, Paragraph B, a section I presume you reviewed extensively before advising your clients to attend this proceeding." Caldwell looked down at the document. His eyes scanned the highlighted yellow text. A faint sheen of sweat appeared on his forehead. He had not read the full will. He had relied on the unnotarized, generic summary my parents provided to him during their initial consultation. He was a local practitioner out of his depth, discovering in real time that his clients had lied to him by omission. Ms. Gable read the text aloud for the court reporter. The phrasing echoed off the glass walls. "The executors possess 0 discretionary power to alter the established disbursement percentages. Fiduciary duty is absolute." She paused, letting the heavy legal terminology settle over the table. "Ignorance of the law is not a defense for fiduciary breach. This is not a family negotiation. This is a probate court matter governed by strict statutory guidelines. By signing Exhibit A and attempting the transfer, your clients did not just make an administrative error, they activated a forfeiture clause." My parents stared at the highlighted text resting on the marble. The legal jargon was dense, but the implications were starting to penetrate their denial. The remaining color rapidly drained from my father's face. He looked at Caldwell, waiting for a defense, a loophole, a sudden legal countermeasure. Caldwell just stared at his hands, recognizing that his malpractice liability had just skyrocketed. He had nothing to offer them. Chloe leaned forward, crossing her arms tightly across her chest. Her patience for administrative procedure was exhausted. She did not understand the vocabulary being deployed, "What does that even mean?" she snapped, her voice sharp and irritated. "They made a mistake on a form. Just fix it so Brandon can get the transfer today. We have vendors calling us every hour. You are dragging this out for no reason." She still thought she was the main character in the room. She still believed the legal system cared about her boutique shipping logistics application. She expected the lawyers to simply apologize and hand her a check. Ms. Gable did not look at Chloe. She maintained her focus exclusively on my parents. She delivered the final blow with a voice devoid of any pity. "It means," Ms. Gable stated, her words dropping like heavy stones, "you are officially removed as executors of this estate. Furthermore, due to the explicit terms of the forfeiture clause you triggered, your $500,000 share is legally voided. Those funds will be redirected to the sole compliant beneficiary, to Audrey." The breathing in the room stopped. My father slumped back in his leather chair, the wind knocked completely out of his lungs. Susan opened her mouth, but no sound emerged. Her hands trembled on the table. They had walked into the building expecting a minor reprimand and a negotiation. They were walking out facing total financial ruin. They had lost their authority, they had lost their inheritance, and they had handed me control over the entire estate. But the destruction of their legal power in a Manhattan conference room was only the first phase of the war. My parents operated on social currency. When cornered, they historically deployed a vast network of extended relatives to shame their opponents into submission. As my mother stared at the marble table, her shock slowly began morphing into a cold, desperate rage. Before the elevator doors even opened on the ground floor, she was already drafting a narrative in her head, preparing to unleash a campaign of reputational destruction. The panic from the Manhattan conference room bled directly into the extended family network. Within 48 hours of the deposition, my smartphone transformed into a beacon of manufactured outrage. My mother operated like a seasoned political operative losing a primary election. She knew her legal standing was disintegrating, so she pivoted to a battlefield where she historically held the advantage: the court of public opinion. My aunts, uncles, and older cousins began calling. I let every single incoming request route to voicemail. I listened to the transcripts while drinking my morning coffee. Aunt Barbara left 3 messages. She is a retired school administrator who treats moral superiority like a competitive sport. She demanded to know how I could leave my grieving parents with nothing. She called me greedy. She stated that Grandpa Thomas would be ashamed of my behavior. Uncle Robert texted me a long, poorly punctuated paragraph about familial loyalty. He runs a local hardware store and views any challenge to elder authority as a personal insult. He accused me of utilizing a legal loophole to steal the retirement funds my parents had rightfully earned. They were attacking a ghost. They were responding to a heavily sanitized, fictionalized version of the story Susan Hayes had hand-delivered to them. My mother likely told them I had hired a predatory lawyer to twist a simple administrative error into a weapon. She painted herself as the victim of a ruthless, ungrateful daughter. Defending yourself against a smear campaign is a strategic error. When you argue with people committed to misunderstanding you, you validate their premise. You give their false narrative oxygen. I did not return their calls. I did not send emotional paragraphs defending my character. I opened my laptop, launched a blank Excel workbook, and began to build a cage out of numbers. In my profession, tracking misplaced capital is identical to tracking misplaced maritime freight. You locate the origin point, you follow the transit documentation, and you identify the final destination. My parents had just handed me a massive behavioral clue. If they possessed the audacity to forge a legal document and hand it to me across a dining room table, they were not novice offenders. People do not start their criminal careers with a $500,000 estate fraud. They work up to it. I realized I needed to look backward. Grandpa Thomas began displaying signs of vascular dementia 36 months before his passing. The decline was gradual but persistent. He misplaced his keys, forgot the names of his actuaries, and eventually lost the ability to manage his own checkbook. My parents had stepped in to assist him. They secured power of attorney to manage his daily expenses and health care costs. At the time, I assumed they were executing their duties with basic human decency. I utilized the weekend to pull public property records from the county registry. I accessed state business entity formations through the Department of State website. I cross-referenced these public filings with the bank routing statements Ms. Gable had acquired during the early discovery phase of our litigation. The math revealed a systematic extraction process. 2 years prior, Brandon launched his first doomed logistics startup. He required seed money. According to the state registry, a limited liability company was formed in his name. According to my grandfather's bank records, a wire transfer of $45,000 was routed to that exact corporate account 4 days later. The memo line read, "Caregiver compensation." 8 months after that, Chloe leased a premium imported vehicle. The down payment was $14,000. The funds originated from a supplementary savings account bearing my grandfather's name. The withdrawal was authorized by my father. The spreadsheet grew. I created columns for the date, the initiating party, the receiving party, the stated purpose, and the actual destination of the capital. I documented phantom home repair invoices, mysterious consulting fees paid to Brandon's associates, and direct cash transfers to Chloe's personal checking account. They had spent 3 years treating a man losing his cognitive functions like an unsupervised automated teller machine. They siphoned his wealth while he sat in his living room, unable to remember what day it was. I tallied the columns. The final sum sat at the bottom of the screen in bold text. $212,000. That was the exact amount my parents had secretly funneled to Chloe and Brandon while my grandfather was still breathing. They did not need to reallocate my inheritance to make things fair. They had already taken their advance. They were simply returning to the well for a second extraction. I exported the spreadsheet as a clean, formatted, portable document format file. I saved it to my desktop. Then I retrieved the digital audio file I had recorded in the dining room, the crystal clear capturing of my mother admitting her intent to steal my designated share. I opened my email client. I populated the blind carbon copy field with 34 addresses. I included Aunt Barbara, Uncle Robert, my adult cousins, and every extended relative who had historically served as an audience for my mother's theatrical performances. I typed a 3-word subject line: estate factual discrepancies. I did not write a lengthy explanation. I did not demand apologies. I drafted a single, objective sentence. Please review the attached financial audit and the corresponding audio documentation for clarification regarding the ongoing probate litigation. I attached the spreadsheet. I attached the audio file. I clicked send. The resulting shockwave was invisible but instantaneous. I monitored the read receipts. Within 10 minutes, the emails were opened. Within 15 minutes, the audio file was downloaded across 24 different devices. My extended family sat in their respective homes, staring at an itemized ledger of elder financial abuse. They listened to the undeniable sound of Susan Hayes utilizing her honeyed voice to confess to a federal crime. The cognitive dissonance was fatal to their outrage. You cannot maintain a posture of moral superiority when the raw data proves you are defending a predator. The flying monkeys went entirely silent. My phone ceased vibrating. The accusatory text messages stopped. The hostile voicemails ended. The machinery of my mother's social influence ground to a permanent halt. Late Sunday evening, Aunt Barbara sent a 2-sentence reply. She stated she was unaware of the details and apologized for her previous messages. She did not ask for further clarification. She simply backed away, terrified of being caught in the blast radius of a detonating reputation. I had stripped my parents of their favorite weapon. The false narrative was dead. My mother could no longer host holiday dinners and spin tales of her own martyrdom. My father could no longer hide behind his quiet, respectable facade. They were socially stranded, exposed by the very numbers they thought they could bury in the dark. They had lost the psychological war. They had lost their extended network. But the legal system still required a formal conclusion. The temporary freeze on the accounts needed to be converted into a permanent ruling. We were heading to the final hearing in the Manhattan Surrogate Court. The The judge was preparing to review the totality of their actions, and unlike my aunts and uncles, the judge possessed the authority to issue a verdict that would alter the trajectory of their lives forever. The final ruling arrived on a crisp Tuesday morning in late October. The autumn winds sweeping through the financial district carried a sharp, biting chill. I walked the 6 blocks from the subway station to the New York County Surrogate Court, holding a lukewarm cup of black coffee. The leaves on the sparse city trees were turning brittle and brown. I felt an overwhelming sense of calm. The frantic energy of the past few months had distilled into a quiet, steady rhythm. The variables were locked. The data was submitted. The equation was about to be solved. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was thick with the weight of generational disputes. The walls of the designated courtroom were lined in dark, heavy oak. The benches were worn smooth by decades of grieving families fighting over fragmented estates. Ms. Gable sat beside me at the plaintiff table. She arranged her manila folders in a perfectly symmetrical line. She did not review her notes. She simply waited, projecting the relaxed confidence of a professional who had already verified the structural integrity of her trap. My parents entered the room 10 minutes later. The transformation in their physical appearance was striking. The social isolation resulting from my email distribution had taken a visible toll. Susan wore a dark, shapeless dress, stripped of her usual vibrant zoning board authority. She avoided looking at the gallery, likely aware that none of her sisters or cousins had shown up to support her. Richard walked with a pronounced stoop, his shoulders pulled forward, carrying the posture of a man who realized his lifelong strategy of conflict avoidance had led him directly into a disaster. Chloe trailed behind them. She lacked her designer trench coat from the deposition. She carried no premium iced coffee. She sat in the first row of the gallery, twisting the strap of her handbag around her fingers. Brandon was noticeably absent. He was likely dealing with the immediate fallout of his unfunded logistics venture, leaving his wife to face the consequences of their shared entitlement alone. Martin Caldwell, their discount attorney, took his seat at the defense table. He unpacked his briefcase with erratic, jerky movements. He dropped a pen, scrambled to pick it up, and shuffled a stack of disorganized papers. He looked like a man preparing to defend a sinking ship with a bucket. The heavy wooden door behind the bench opened. Judge Helen Croft entered the room. Judge Croft possessed a reputation for surgical efficiency. She was a former corporate litigator who transitioned to the bench, bringing a deep intolerance for emotional manipulation in financial matters. She did not view estate law as a venue for family therapy. She viewed it as the enforcement of a binding contract between the deceased and the state. She took her seat, adjusted her reading glasses, and opened the thick file resting on her desk. The room fell entirely silent. The ticking of the wall clock echoed against the oak paneling. She did not ask for opening statements. She did not require a full trial. When the evidence is irrefutable, a judge possesses the authority to issue a summary judgment, bypassing the performative arguments of the defense. She spent 4 minutes reading the documents in front of her. She reviewed the certified will, the transcribed audio confession, the handwritten ivory letter, and the spreadsheet detailing the prior unauthorized withdrawals. Mr. Caldwell, Judge Croft began, her voice cutting through the quiet room like a serrated blade, you submitted a motion requesting family mediation. You argued that your clients misunderstood their administrative duties. Caldwell stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with a shaking hand. Yes, Your Honor. My clients were attempting to navigate a complex domestic hardship. They believed they were acting in the best interest of the estate by reallocating funds to a beneficiary in distress. Judge Croft lowered her glasses, fixing her gaze on the sweating attorney. Mediation is reserved for parties attempting to resolve a misinterpretation of terms, she stated. It is not a sanctuary for individuals caught attempting to execute wire fraud. Caldwell opened his mouth to formulate a response, but the judge raised a single hand, silencing him instantly. She turned her attention away from the lawyer and focused directly on my parents. Richard stared at the floor. Susan gripped the edge of the defense table, her knuckles turning a stark, bloodless white. Mr. and Mrs. Hayes, the judge continued, the cadence of her speech deliberate and unforgiving. You were entrusted with a very specific, legally binding role. A fiduciary duty is a sacred legal obligation. It is not a suggestion. It is not a flexible guideline you can discard when you deem it inconvenient. The deceased, Thomas Hayes, drafted a meticulous document outlining his exact wishes for his accumulated wealth. She picked up the ivory stationery, holding it up for the room to see. "You did not make an administrative error," she pronounced. "You sat in your dining room, drafted a new contract, and signed your names to a document explicitly intended to bypass a legally filed will. You willfully attempted to defraud a named beneficiary out of $450,000. You utilized your position of trust to orchestrate a theft." The word theft hung in the air. Susan flinched, the reality of the term striking her physical form. She had spent her entire life framing her actions as maternal care. Hearing a judge classify her behavior as a common crime dismantled the core of her identity. "Therefore," Judge Croft announced, picking up her wooden gavel, "I am issuing an immediate summary judgment. Richard and Susan Hayes, you are officially stripped of your titles as co-executors of the Thomas Hayes estate. You no longer possess any authority over these assets." My father closed his eyes, releasing a long, shuddering breath. Losing the title was a humiliating defeat, but it was merely the preamble. The true cost of their arrogance was about to be quantified. Furthermore, the judge stated, reviewing the highlighted text of Section 4, Paragraph B, the court finds that your actions constitute a direct violation of the fiduciary parameters established by the deceased. You have formally triggered the forfeiture clause embedded within the will. Chloe let out a sharp, involuntary gasp from the gallery. She understood the math. She knew the safety net was disintegrating. "The planned redistribution of funds to Chloe Hayes is permanently canceled," the judge declared. "In addition, the $500,000 designated share originally allocated to Richard and Susan Hayes is hereby voided. You forfeit your right to any capital from this estate." My mother let out a strangled, breathless sound. She turned her head, looking wildly at Caldwell, expecting him to object, to file a motion, to do something to stop the financial hemorrhage. Caldwell kept his eyes glued to his legal pad, refusing to engage. He knew the ruling was unassailable. "Because you have breached the trust of this office," Judge Croft concluded, setting the paperwork down flat on her desk, "the entirety of the remaining assets totaling $1.4 million defaults to the sole compliant beneficiary. The court orders the immediate transfer of all estate holdings to Audrey Hayes." She struck the sounding block with her gavel, a sharp, definitive crack that finalized the destruction of their sovereignty. "We are adjourned." The judge stood up and exited through the heavy wooden door. The silence she left behind was suffocating. In the first row of the gallery, Chloe broke down. She openly sobbed, pressing her face into her hands. The reality of her impending bankruptcy, the loss of the luxury vehicle, the collapse of Brandon's facade, it all crashed down upon her simultaneously. There was no bailout. There was no secret reserve fund. She was finally facing the unshielded friction of the real world. At the defense table, Richard put his head in his hands, resting his elbows on the wood. He looked like a hollow shell of a man, crushed by the weight of a $500,000 penalty. He had sacrificed his relationship with me, his reputation among his siblings, and his own financial security, all to avoid having a difficult conversation with his wife. Susan did not cry. She turned her head slowly and stared directly at me across the aisle. Her mouth hung open slightly. Her eyes searched my face, looking for a trace of the daughter she used to manage. She was waiting for me to stand up, to walk over, to offer a compromise. She expected me to show mercy, to intervene, to save them the way I had saved Chloe from eviction, the way I had saved them from countless minor inconveniences. She thought the familial bond would eventually override the legal ruling. I did not blink. I felt no urge to cross the room. I felt no desire to soften the blow. They had engineered this precise outcome through their own relentless greed. I turned my attention to the plaintiff table. I picked up my manila folder, slid it into my leather briefcase, and secured the brass latch. The click echoed in the quiet room. Ms. Gable gave me a brief, respectful nod. Our contract was fulfilled. The data had prevailed. I stood up, smoothed the front of my navy suit, and turned toward the exit. I walked past the defense table without a single glance in their direction. I walked past my sobbing sister in the gallery. I pushed open the heavy oak doors, stepping out into the marble hallway, preparing to leave the building. But the physical distance was not enough to deter them. The loss of $500,000 triggers a desperate survival instinct, and as I moved toward the staircase leading down to the street, I heard the rapid, panicked sound of my parents' footsteps rushing to catch me. I pushed through the heavy bronze and glass doors of the courthouse, stepping out into the crisp, biting autumn air. The traffic on Center Street roared past, a steady stream of yellow taxis and delivery trucks. The ambient noise of the city felt clean and indifferent. The air smelled of roasted nuts and exhaust. I took a deep breath, letting the cold fill my lungs. The weight of the past decade, the constant hum of manufactured crises, the endless calculation of other people's debts, it was entirely gone. Before I reached the bottom step, I heard the frantic, desperate sound of my name. Audrey. I stopped. I did not turn around immediately. The sound was unfamiliar. It was not the polished, authoritative tone of Susan Hayes, the zoning board chairwoman. It was not the passive, avoidant mumble of Richard Hayes, the regional manager. It was the raw, unfiltered sound of two people realizing they had just driven their own car off a financial cliff. I turned slowly. My parents were rushing down the granite steps. They were practically tripping over each other in their haste. Chloe was nowhere to be seen, likely still sobbing in the gallery, unwilling to face the person she had spent her life treating like an automated teller machine. My father reached the pavement first. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving beneath his suit jacket. His face was a mask of sheer panic. The stoic facade he maintained during my childhood had completely collapsed. "Audrey, please," he begged, his voice cracking on the second syllable. "You have to listen to me. We need to talk about this. We need to figure this out as a family." He was still deploying the vocabulary of unity to excuse his own betrayal. He wanted to renegotiate a contract that had already been executed by a judge. "There is nothing to figure out, Dad," I said. My voice was steady, devoid of the emotional static they expected. "The court has made its ruling. The estate is settled. We have a second mortgage," he blurted out, the shame of his admission forcing him to look away from me. "We took out a line of credit on the house in Syosset 2 years ago. We were counting on Grandpa Thomas and his inheritance to clear the debt. If we lose our $500,000 share, we lose the house. We cannot carry the monthly payments." My mother caught up to him. She grabbed his arm, attempting to steady herself. Her eyes were wide, darting between my face and the busy street. "Chloe has nothing," Susan added, her voice trembling. "Brandon is going to lose his business by Friday. They are facing eviction. You cannot leave your own sister on the street, Audrey. You cannot leave your parents homeless. You have $1.4 million. You have more than enough to fix this." She was still trying to assign me the role of the shock absorber. She still believed my primary function on Earth was to subsidize their bad variables. She was asking me to voluntarily hand over the money she had just spent 3 months trying to steal. I looked at them standing on the pavement. I did not feel the white-hot fury I had experienced when I first opened that fake summary letter in my apartment lobby. I did not feel the simmering resentment of my 20s when I was wiring rent money while eating cheap takeout. I felt something entirely different. I felt clarity. It was a cold, absolute realization that these two individuals were not my protectors. They were liabilities. "You sat in your dining room," I began, keeping my volume low, forcing them to lean in to hear me over the traffic. "You sat across from me and told me you were taking my $450,000 because it was fair." Susan opened her mouth to interrupt, a desperate defense already forming on her lips. I held up a single hand. The gesture was so sharp, so final, that she snapped her mouth shut. "You told me I had a good salary," I continued, maintaining direct eye contact with my mother. "You told me Chloe needed the money more. You decided that my responsibility was a resource you could mine to pay for her incompetence. You decided that my financial security was expendable. My father stared at the concrete sidewalk, his shoulders shaking. The reality of his complicity was crushing him. He had signed the handwritten confession. He had agreed to the theft. He could no longer pretend he was just a passive bystander. You wanted the money distributed based on who deserved it, I said, delivering the final assessment. You wanted a merit-based allocation. I paused, letting the truth of their own strategy wash over them. Grandpa just happened to agree with you, I concluded. I did not wait for a response. I turned my back to them. I walked down the street toward the parking garage, merging into the flow of pedestrians. I did not look over my shoulder. I did not check to see if they were following me. I simply kept walking until the sound of their voices was swallowed by the noise of the city. The physical separation was only the first step. To ensure the boundary remained impenetrable, I needed to eliminate their access entirely. I did not go home and block their phone numbers. Blocking a number implies a temporary boundary, a door that can be unlocked if the user decides to read the blocked messages later. I required a permanent structural change. The following morning, I walked into a cellular provider retail store. I canceled my account, surrendered my old device, and purchased a brand new smartphone with an unlisted, secure number. I updated my contact information with my employer, my bank, and Ms. Gable. I did not provide the new digits to a single extended family member. I severed the digital tether completely. Then I began the process of geographic relocation. White Plains was too accessible. It was a brief train ride from Syosset. My mother knew my address. She knew the layout of my building. Desperation breeds stalking behavior. When people lose $500,000 and face foreclosure, they do not respect locked lobby doors. I contacted a specialized real estate agent. Within 14 days, I listed my condo for sale. The market was highly competitive, and the property went into contract above asking price within 48 hours. I packed my essential belongings, hired a discreet moving company, and placed the majority of my furniture into secure, climate-controlled storage. I took the $1.4 million inheritance, combined it with my own substantial savings, and began searching for a permanent fortress. I did not want another apartment. I did not want shared walls or a homeowner association. I wanted acreage. I wanted silence. I found it in the Hudson Valley. It was a beautiful, custom-built, mid-century modern property sitting on 12 acres of heavily wooded land. It featured a wraparound porch, large windows overlooking a private stream, and a gated driveway positioned a quarter-mile off the main county road. It was secluded, quiet, and entirely defensible. I bought the property in cash. I did not require a mortgage. I did not require a co-signer. The deed was registered under an anonymous limited liability company established by Ms. Gable, ensuring my name would never appear on public tax records. I became a ghost to the people who used to track my every move. I took the remaining capital, a sum hovering near $800,000, and transferred it to a ruthless wealth management firm in Manhattan. I instructed my portfolio manager to invest aggressively in diversified index funds and municipal bonds. I automated the growth of my wealth, ensuring the money my grandfather left me would compound silently, generating a permanent stream of passive income. I did not leave a forwarding address with the post office. I instructed the human resources department at my logistics firm to scrub my home address from any internal directories. I deleted my social media profiles. I erased my digital footprint, removing any breadcrumbs my sister or my mother might utilize to track my location. I gave them exactly what they had given me during those 68 days of punishment in my 20s. I gave them exactly what they offered me on the Sunday they sat in their dining room and attempted to ruin my financial future. I gave them complete, unrelenting silence. The silence was not a negotiation tactic. It was not a punishment designed to extract an apology. It was a permanent state of being. I was no longer interested in teaching them a lesson or forcing them to acknowledge their behavior. They were facing foreclosure. Chloe was facing bankruptcy. They were about to navigate the brutal friction of a world where their actions finally carried a tangible cost, and I refused to provide them with an audience for their collapse. The boundary was set, the fortress was built, and the consequences of their arrogance were unfolding exactly as the math predicted. It has been exactly 24 months since the gavel struck the sounding block in the Manhattan courtroom. I am 36 years old today. The autumn air in the Hudson Valley carries a distinct profile, blending the scent of damp pine needles with the rich aroma of pour-over coffee. I am sitting on the cedar planks of my wraparound porch, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket. The nearest neighbor resides 3 miles down a winding dirt road. The silence out here is not the punitive, manipulative quiet my mother used to deploy when she wanted to extract an apology. This silence is structural. It is the sound of total autonomy. I still work as a senior supply chain analyst. My net worth dictates that formal employment is no longer a financial requirement. My investment portfolio generates enough passive yield to sustain my lifestyle indefinitely. However, I maintain my position because I genuinely enjoy the architecture of logistics. I appreciate environments governed by predictable rules, where cause and effect are linked by verifiable data. When a shipping container leaves a port in Rotterdam, I know the exact date it will arrive in Newark. If a vendor fails to meet a deadline, a penalty is automatically applied. I find profound comfort in systems that cannot be swayed by tears or emotional blackmail. I do not actively seek information regarding my estranged relatives. I do not maintain hidden social media profiles to monitor their decline. I receive periodic updates exclusively through my attorney. Ms. Gable functions as a firewall, filtering out the emotional debris and forwarding only the necessary administrative facts. Yesterday morning, a brief encrypted email arrived in my inbox. It contained 3 bullet points detailing the final resolution of a lingering estate tax form, but it also included a concise summary of the current circumstances surrounding Richard, Susan, and Chloe. The report confirmed exactly what the mathematics predicted. 6 months ago, Chloe and Brandon officially filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. Without my grandfather and his inheritance to plug the structural holes in their sinking ship, the water rushed in immediately. Brandon lost his boutique logistics company. His investors demanded their capital, discovered the hollow core of his business model, and initiated asset seizure protocols. The luxury imported vehicle Chloe proudly displayed on the internet was repossessed directly from her driveway. They were evicted from their premium Brooklyn apartment when they failed to produce rent for 4 consecutive months. Chloe had spent her entire adult life treating consequence like an abstract concept meant for other people. She finally collided with the concrete reality of a zero balance. My parents fared no better. The second mortgage they secretly extracted against their Syosset home became a toxic liability. Without their $500,000 share of the estate to clear the principal, the interest rates devoured their monthly income. The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings late last winter. According to Ms. Gable and her routine public records search, Richard and Susan were forced to vacate the property they had inhabited for 3 decades. They currently reside in a modest 2-bedroom rental apartment in a neighboring town. The financial ruin was only a fraction of their penalty. The social devastation was absolute. When I distributed that spreadsheet and the audio confession to the extended family, I permanently dismantled my mother's carefully constructed reputation. She could no longer host lavish holiday dinners or preside over the local zoning board with unearned authority. Her peers, her siblings, and her neighbors understood precisely what she had attempted to do. She became a pariah in her own community. My father, who spent his life avoiding difficult conversations, is now trapped in a small rental unit with a disgraced spouse, living the remainder of his retirement in the shadow of his own cowardice. They sit in tight quarters, likely blaming each other for the collapse of their sovereignty. I open my laptop resting on the small wrought iron table beside my chair. I log into my wealth management portal. The screen illuminates, displaying a series of upward trending graphs. The original capital from the inheritance has compounded significantly over the past 2 years, bolstered by calculated market investments and tax-efficient municipal bonds. I watch the numbers shift. They represent a fortress of security that no one can ever breach. I think about the girl I was in my 20s. I remember the girl who wired $800 to cover a broken lease. I picture the girl who absorbed the financial blows of a sister who refused to grow up. I recall the girl who sat in restaurants, listening to her parents demand she sacrifice her retirement to save a fraudulent brother-in-law. That version of Audrey no longer exists. She was systematically dismantled and replaced by the woman sitting on this porch, holding a ceramic mug, overseeing a multi-million-dollar ledger. Society frequently misunderstands the concept of peace. People often define peace as the simple absence of fighting, assuming that if nobody is yelling, harmony has been achieved. That definition is a trap designed to benefit abusers. True peace is the presence of absolute security. It is the profound, unshakable knowledge that your resources, your energy, and your future belong entirely to you. My family thought my boundaries were a negotiation. They treated my limits as starting points for an argument. They believed they could push, manipulate, and rewrite the rules until I surrendered. They learned, in a sterile Manhattan courtroom, that my boundaries are a brick wall. When you drive a vehicle into a brick wall at full speed, the wall does not negotiate. The wall simply stands there while the vehicle destroys itself upon impact. My parents chose to accelerate. They paid $500,000 to learn the physics of that collision. I close the laptop screen. The sun climbs higher over the tree line, casting long shadows across the frost-covered grass. The day is entirely mine to design. Before I leave you, if you are still listening to this story, I want to ask you a final question. Have you ever stepped aside and allowed a toxic person to dig their own grave simply because they were too arrogant to realize you stopped handing them the shovel? Have you ever let someone destroy themselves because they assumed you were too weak to push back? Drop a comment below and share your experience. I read every single one. Thank you for listening, and remember, the strongest defense is sometimes just letting them put their intentions in writing. Looking out over the tree line of my Hudson Valley property, the morning frost slowly melting under the rising sun, I realize the transformation is finished. The air here is clean, untainted by the suffocating expectations of my past. I no longer carry the weight of my sister's unpaid bills or my father's chronic avoidance. I spent the first 3 decades of my life operating as a financial safety net for individuals who viewed my stability as a resource to exploit. The transition from that tense dining room table in Syosset to this quiet cedar porch required strategy. I want to share 5 specific lessons I extracted from this ordeal. First, always prioritize documentation over emotional reactions. When my parents handed me that fraudulent estate summary, my initial instinct was to initiate a screaming match. Instead, I visited the surrogate court and secured a signed confession. Manipulators thrive in the fog of verbal arguments where shifting blame is easy. When you force them to record their intentions on paper, you remove their ability to rewrite history. Data ignores feelings. Second, silence acts as a vital strategic asset. Arrogant individuals expect vocal resistance. When you provide them with a quiet void, they fill that space with their own miscalculations. By refusing to argue during the 45-day waiting period, I allowed my mother to grow comfortable enough to incriminate herself. Silence strips away their leverage and provides you with a commanding tactical advantage. Third, a boundary without a severe consequence functions merely as a suggestion. For years, I asked my family to stop demanding money. Yet I continued paying my sister's lease penalties. The dynamic only changed when the penalty for crossing my boundary became the loss of a $500,000 inheritance. You cannot negotiate your limits. You construct them out of stone and let the opposing party experience the impact. Fourth, sharing a genetic bloodline does not equate to a lifelong obligation of servitude. Society conditions us to believe we owe our relatives endless loyalty. My grandfather understood that loyalty serves as a reciprocal contract. When my parents breached that agreement by attempting to steal my designated future, my obligation to them dissolved. You are never required to dismantle your own life to subsidize the failures of your family members. Fifth, Authentic peace is the direct byproduct of removing toxic liabilities. I used to think peace meant surviving a holiday dinner without a major argument. I know now that peace is waking up in a secluded house, drinking premium coffee, and knowing the people who used to drain my savings account no longer possess my phone number. These 5 principles reshaped my reality. They turned a compliant supply chain analyst into the untouchable architect of her own future. My parents paid an exorbitant price to learn those rules, but the education I received was worth the struggle. If my journey resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Maya Tells Stories. We explore the real narratives of people who refuse to remain victims. Your support helps build a community of strong survivors. I want to hear from you in the comment section below. Which of these 5 lessons struck the deepest chord with your own life experiences? Drop your thoughts and let me know how you enforce your own boundaries. I read every single comment. Thank you for listening, and remember that your future belongs to you alone.